In the last session, we have been discussing about different functional properties of proteins like solubility, water holding capacity, oil holding capacity, emulsification, and finally foaming, right? I was telling you that usually plant proteins or insect proteins may have one or more these properties. It's not necessary that a single protein can have all these properties. And these properties are important to be measured. It's simply because we can use these proteins in one or other applications. We can create new foods, we can create new food structures, we can create new food flavors, we can create new texture based on all these properties. So that's the reason why we need to measure functional properties of proteins when they are present in individual form, right? Please note that in the last session, I did not talk about the whole food, right? I was talking everything on an ingredient basis, which individual ingredient, protein ingredient, for example, we were talking about soy protein isolate, soy protein concentrate, pea protein isolate, they're all ingredients. I was also mentioning to you in my previous lessons that ingredients cannot necessarily be used directly because of their less taste or no taste. So we need to again functionalize them with other techniques and technology. So that's we're going to hear now. So welcome back to the lecture number 8. That is application of alternative proteins in plant-based meats and dairy alternatives. And I must tell you that some of them I have already covered in my previous lessons. I've given you a lot of examples about meat analogs, and I have given a lot of examples about the dairy alternatives and so on in my previous lessons. If you can recall, I showed you a couple of pictures that I've taken when I was visiting the US supermarkets, and different kinds of analogs or dairy products are already in the market, especially in the US and America. And I also heard from some of you that in India also the market is rising. You can still find a lot of soy milk for sure. May also finding now almond milk and other things. I'm not very sure whether you can find meat analogs in our supermarket, but it might come at one fine day very soon. But I know that Indian companies and startups are also working in this direction. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about different types of plant-based meats and dairy alternatives, and basically the process we're doing to get them and what are the challenges we have, and those things I'm going to discuss. It's not necessarily, I'm not going to show how to create an alternative product at this particular lecture. I'm going to give you an overview of what is being done today and why we need an analog and why do we need an alternative product. Am I clear? So again, I'll come back to my this very second slide from my first lecture. Why do we have to go for alternatives? It clearly shows that animal-based products are responsible for greenhouse gas. So we need to have a transition from animal-based to plant-based food products, right? And it is clearly shown is that when you talk about whole animal plant-based foods, the whole grains, vegetables, and all this production or consumption has a very little environmental footprint, and they say that it could be like 20-fold lower, even 100-fold lower than production of, let's say, beef. And that's the reason why we need to have a transition. But I must again have to emphasize the point here is that one of our students were also asking at that time, why do we need to get ingredients? Why can't we eat whole grains? That's always a question we ask in the Indian subcontinent for sure, because traditionally in our cooking culture is that we are less ingredient based, we are more into whole thing based, right? That's the food culture we have, but it's not necessarily the case in every world. And moreover, the world is growing in a rapid pace, and we really need different kind of foods, right? We are also following Western food in India also. If you go to Western world, they're also following the Indian food culture. So now because of easy transportation of people and things, now it's kind of everything is available everywhere. So we want to produce the food here, but we have to market in the USA. The USA would like to produce food in the USA. They would like to have a market in India. So then basically they have to think about how do we satisfy Indian's tongue. and we should think about how do we satisfy Americans' tongue, right? And there, the food product, the ingredients become super important, and where the processing also becomes super important, so that we can tweak the product so that it gets the desirable taste and texture relevant to that particular portion of people in a particular continent or a country. So you can clearly see that when compared to Asian people, the Western people, let's say Europe and Northern American people, they consume a lot of meat. And the meat is there in their almost daily diet, and the protein they consume majority that comes from dairy and meat in Western world. But in Asian world, we get it mostly from dairy and vegetables, right? Vegetable is mostly our main source of proteins, but if in the other part of the world, it's still the meat is the major portion of protein. And that's the reason why we are trying to mimic the meat. Just to answer why we want to mimic the meat, because they are not eating meat only for the proteins purpose. It's in their tradition, it's in their culture. It's also in Indian culture. For example, if you have a festival, if you have a marriage, if you have some guests are coming, we bring meat. All right? And it's because it's in our culture. It's not just because we want to get proteins or when we have a guest. No, that's not the idea. We want to have a meat when we have a guest because it's the culture that meaty that brings people together. Right? It's something different. And that's the reason why we need to somehow create plant into meat. Right? And that's not easy. Cows can do that one easily, right? They eat grass and become meat. It's a bad way of saying things, but in this case, now we don't want to have an animal here in between, because that is having more greenhouse gas emission. Without animals, we need to bring plant into meat. We need to convert insects into meat. How do we do that? And that is where the technology comes into play, right? That is where the ingredients comes into play. That's where the processing comes into play, okay? Now, if you look into the market, currently we have plant-based, and we have insect-based, and we have cultured meat and micro-derived alternative proteins. And I was already telling you that the plant-based is the major market today. Almost all products sold today is actually plant-based. Mainly soy-based products are available. So it's only the small portion of alternative proteins come from other parts, insect, microalgae, and so on. So there is also, I mentioned that there's a huge demand for that one. I don't believe in this number if it's right, because I got a different number from a different paper, but don't worry about the number. But remember that the trend is increasing. We are having around 10 to 15% growth in alternative protein market every year in most of the countries. So when it comes to environment, I also mentioned that alternative protein production has a less greenhouse gas emission, less carbon footprint, plus the biggest thing is that they need less space. For example, to cultivate, to raise a cow for animal husbandry, you need a large area, but you don't need that much area to grow microalgae or insects. And that's where also you get the benefit. Now we'll look a little bit more into what is exactly needed if you want to convert a plant into meat or milk. Okay, to convert plant into meat or milk, a lot of things comes into play. We just talked about extraction in my previous class, right? Then we talked about analysis, but beyond that, we need to get too many things. If you look into the meat analog, just as an example, all right, we discussed about protein. We need a protein with different functional properties. We need a protein with a good water holding capacity, and so on, right? But protein itself is not sufficient. We need to have a lot of different characteristics on these meat analogs. Then only a human being can consume it, because we have a tongue, remember. So if you just say it's high in protein, people would not buy it. Lot of things has to be considered. The first thing is we need to look for about compositional characteristic. Okay, how much protein is there? People always like it if your food has a lot of protein, what we call halo effect. It's not necessarily true that if you have more protein, it's healthy. It's not true, not necessarily true, but it should have a sufficiently good amount of proteins. right? Not only protein, there should be some amount of carbohydrates, not necessarily for the nutritional purpose. Carbohydrates will give the texture, right? It can acting as a filling agent, it can act as a binding agent, right? So, so you cannot get the bulkiness of the food without having carbohydrate. And sometimes carbohydrate are also dietary fibers. So there is a lot of advantages. And we also need fat, right? Because fat gives a unique flavor when you cook, right? Chicken and fish and all these things, I mean, when you cook, you get a unique flavor because there is a fat will be oxidized and start releasing small minor volatile compounds, and these volatile compounds gives you taste, right? Sometimes good taste, sometimes bad taste, but often it's a good taste. Let's consider it like that, right? And that's the reason why fat is also important. But not only that, fat is also important in terms of diet, because we need to consume polyunsaturated fatty acid. Do you remember PUFA? Omega 3 and omega 6 fatty acids, right? And that should be a part of our diet, because everybody, there are many research articles shows that it's good for your brain, it's good for your cardiovascular health and so on. So you need to consume good amount of fat. And we also need, that's also missing thing here, is that we also need minerals, right? We need, for example, we eat meat not only for proteins, meat also contains minerals, right? For example, we need to take a small amount of iron every day, because without iron we can't get hemoglobin in our body, right? We need iron. So if you are continuously eating meat analogs devoid of iron, maybe I not become healthy. Although it contains 25% protein, it is not having iron, maybe there is a problem, right? So we need to create a whole food. Remember, it's not about eating ingredient. We need to create a whole food, and for that we need to add more and more components to the food system. Now, this all about nutritional aspect. Then I was telling about even if we have all the nutrients, but if it tastes bad, we will not buy. Your children will not eat food if it is not tasting good, right? Taste is important. Taste is a very generic word here, basically. That combines everything. Is the flavor perception, is the texture perception, everything should be there. So, and this is the, I would say this is the number one priority in most of the cases, right? Taste, right? And we all know that plant proteins are not tasting good, unfortunately. Except soy, most of the plant proteins, even soy has a small flavor, as having this grassy flavor, right? They feel very grassy because they call it as it's because hexanol or some other kind of volatile compounds associated with these proteins. They come during production, purification, and so on. And that grassy flavor, actually, people hate that. They don't want to drink milk having grassy flavor. So we need milk that tastes like a milk if you want to consume it. And the second thing is that the color is also important. One of the biggest challenges of plant protein, we also discussed in one of my other classes, almost all plant proteins are colored. They have brown, they have blackish color, they are greenish color, for example, sunflower proteins. If the protein itself is having a color, it's a big problem. For example, imagine my protein is very green in color, my chicken also becomes green. I don't want to eat green chicken, and I don't feel that my chicken or let's say pork, it should be red in color. Meat is kind of a tendency that it should visibly red, then only consumer will buy it. So we can add additional color later during the production and processing and cooking, but we don't want to have our ingredients colored, because that will compromise the final product. And then we need all these other properties which we just discussed, right? It has to have a good structure. It has to has protein has to maintain the structure, because without structure it cannot maintain functional properties and so on. Though a lot of work has to be done in this part also. Then we also talk about nutritional value, right? Once you eat, it has to be digested properly. Okay, now it is digested. It has to go to our bloodstream. That should be good bioavailability should be there. And sometime they also come up with some unwanted things. Somebody was talking about, okay, if you look into the package of this plant-based analogs, ingredient list. There's numerous ingredients have been added, whether it's good or bad, nobody knows, right? We try to preserve the color, we try to preserve the taste, that we add ingredients, and that might have a problem, or I don't know whether it's really a problem, but that consumers can hate. And then salt level, that is something we have to be careful, because meat, to make it meaty, you have to add some kind of salt and so on. That might also have a problem. And this is something we've already discussed, that the functionality properties are also important. Now, just think how many problems and how many things we need to consider to convert plant into meat or meat analog. It's not an easy task, right? A lot of things has to be taken care to get plant into meat, to convert plant into meat. So it's not a one PhD work, it's 100 PhD work to get that product. Fortunately, a lot of people in the world in the food science and technology are working in this particular area, so the field is growing like anything. There's a rapid growth in this alternative food area or analog area at the moment, and hundreds of startups are there, and hundreds of companies are finding this is the way forward. Because when the government says, because it's not about the science and technology, it's also politically supported at the moment in most of the countries. Most of the country politically, it said that you need to reduce consumption of animal based, and automatically the industries are start working on producing more plant based. There's a lot of meat industry, there's a lot of dairy industries have now the new portfolio in their production list, plant based. They have been doing meat and milk business like for the last 50-60 years, but now they have a plant based on their agenda. It's simply because we need to have this transition. So we all need to work together to get plant into meat. Okay. How are you producing the plant-based products today? We have, let's say, we have a plant cell with proteins, and then we are doing a lot of extraction here, and then we get the protein powder. And the protein powder can be different qualities, like 50%, 80%, 90%, and so on. And sometimes we need to further purify them, right? Another degree of purification, right? This is purification. This is extraction. And once we purified, then we get ingredients, and then we add a lot of other ingredients here. Then you get a food matrix. Okay. Once the food matrix is ready, it is not done. It will be stored, or it will be cooked, or it will be fried, it will be frozen. A lot of things will happen here. At the end of the day, it comes to we consumer. It's again a lot of things involved in this here. We have been discussing only until here in our previous lectures. Am I clear? So just to give you an overview, that the production of single meat analog contains a lot of value chains. It's not an easy business. I mean, one person cannot do that. One industry cannot do that. There's a lot of possibility that many people can involve to get the final product that human being can use. Now, I was talking a little bit about converting an ingredient into food matrix, right? Converting an ingredient into food matrix. How do we do that today? Let's take as an example insect. And we have been discussing in our very first class about insect proteins. And when I asked you the question, how many of you would like to eat insects? Nobody raised your hand, right? Some part of the world they do eat, but the rest of the world they don't want to eat insect as a whole food, simply because there is a culture, there is a perception that it's not good, oh it's a bug, oh it's carrying some disease, I don't want to eat it, right? If I say, can you eat houseflies, can you eat cockroaches, but they are also a 50% proteins I'm talking about, right? But we don't want to eat them whole. However, to solve this problem, then we have all these technologies, convert insect into a protein powder, right? But can we eat the powder directly? Can we eat wheat flour like this one? No, we make chapati out of it, right? We need to make bread out of it, and then only we can eat. Unfortunately, we can't make chapati and bread directly out of plant proteins or insect proteins. That's also a problem. Wheat flour has a very nice gluten network and make nice chapatis, nice rotis and all these things, right? But insect proteins, I don't know, the roti will have this, paratha will not have that stretching behavior. You can't make that dough. You can use it like a 50% replacing wheat flour, but not 100%. Then there is a problem again, right? Then we need to do again processing. One of the processing we are doing today is extrusion. Have you heard about this word? I'm going to give an exclusive lecture on extrusion later in next half an hour, where we convert this powder into a new texture. Because if you want to have a chicken, it has to be fibrous in nature. If you want to have a beef meat, it has to be like juicy. That texture should be there. If you want to have an egg, you know that egg, that grainy kind of thing, that texture it has to get. So to get all these textures, a lot of processing can be done. One of them will be extrusion, but you can also do a lot of this one, homogenization, texturization, many other techniques are there. So again, you need to process it, and then you get, let's say, meat analog or maybe milk as an example. Now what we are doing exactly, just by processing everything, instead of eating insect directly, we are eating the insect products. Can you see? So this is where the technology is heading to nowadays. You don't have to eat insects directly. And it's also not possible to eat microalgae directly. We talked about a lot of problems here because microalgae is not digestible in our body, especially let's say chlorella. It has a very strong cell wall. Our stomach does not have cellulase enzyme. You can't digest it completely. So, however, if somebody can get the microalgal proteins, maybe we can make a meat analogs out of it, then we can consume it. Okay? Now, another thing is that, especially talking about processing. So, if you look into this one, a plant-based thing has so many ingredients. Can you see here? Right? It has binding agent, it has antioxidant, it has minerals, and it has acetic acid. All these things are added. They're not naturally present. Keep that in mind. In the natural meat, the animal has created in the biosynthetic pathway, right? That's all natural. But in case of artificial meat, we take proteins from soy, right? We take vitamins from plants, okay? We take minerals from some seawater, let's say. We take other things from calcium from somewhere else, right? Everything is sourced from different sources, and they're all mixed together, and then you get the final product. And in between, what do we have? Processing. And this is a big question mark at the moment. Whether we need to do processing, whether it's good or bad. Without processing, you don't get the texture, you don't get the color, you don't get the flavor. But processing also brings some problems sometimes, right? Have you heard about the word ultra processing? Nowadays, there is a big debate is going on around the world whether we should use the word ultra processing or not, right? Because when you write the word ultra processed, consumers say, oh, maybe it's something super bad. I don't want to touch it. Ultra processed. They say that maybe bread is also ultra processed, if I'm not wrong. UHT milk may be ultra processed. It's more about how much heat load, how much processing, and other things it has. But without processing, we don't get anything. But there is a big question mark in this area, how the processing and ingredients are affecting the final quality of the food product. Are they creating some unwanted things? Are they creating things which we don't know? Because we need to feed this to our young children. We need to feed this to our elderly people. Can they metabolize all these things properly? Is there a problem? And there is a huge research gap in this particular area. So I recommend that if you would like to pursue research in this area, you can think about processing induced modification of proteins, processing induced changes in food, how that affects human body. There's a huge research gap. Nobody knows because we are using top-down approach today. What do you mean by top-down approach? That means we first create the product, then we give to the human being, right? Then we wait whether the human being is happy or he will die. We never know because the human dies slowly, don't die immediately because you're not feeding poisons, right? Right? But it has to be bottom-up approach because we slowly need to understand which ingredient is bad, what is the problem with soy, what is the problem with added minerals, what is the problem with added emulsifier. That we don't know, right? Everybody is talking about taste, flavor, texture. If it is tasting good, if the flavor is good, if the texture is good, okay, let's get into the market. That's what exactly happening today. It's not, I'm not telling it's bad, because we need to have some transition, it's good. However, how that is affecting the human body in the long run, because we want to keep the human race for several generations. Our food is actually defining how we behave. Our food defines how we produce our offspring. How our food defines how we think, right? All this linked with the food. The question mark is, okay, whether or not these plant-based analogs or meat are good or bad. I don't have any data on that one. I'm not telling that it's bad. Please don't take that as a take-home message. We don't know, and there's a lot of room for research in this particular area. Okay. And now I'll give you a little bit examples on some of our research, what we have been doing in our university to get some of the analogs, some of the alternatives. We do a lot of research on fermentation. I'll talk about fermentation exclusively in one of my future lectures. So today I don't have much time. I have to delete all the slides, but I'll take it in my future lecture. So we do fermentation because if I was mentioning that this processing, what we do, heating, cooking, boiling, extrusion, everybody thinks, it might be good or it might not be bad. But we have been using historically fermentation, right? Some of our foods are also fermented in India also. China, soy and tempeh in Indonesia, they are all fermented foods. So we have a strong tradition in the modern world, fermentation, and we believe that fermentation is good. So in this work, one of our colleagues, I think, I don't recall her name now, she did a lot of nice work and she could convert this pea protein isolate into cheese. Can you see? Cheese blocks. And we have a guest lecture on the last day, on the 16th of October, where one of my colleagues will talk exclusively about how plant-based proteins can be used to create a cheesy structure. Then we also have another colleague, Rene and others, and they have been working on mushroom. Mushroom is a fungi, right? And it also has a good amount of protein, and those mushroom mycelium can be fermented or can create a very meaty texture. They took a fermentation approach, and what they found was that this fermented hyphae, after heating, it gets kind of a meaty flavor and meaty texture. So basically, why I'm highlighting fermentation here is that there is no much processing here. There is a processing, but that processing is done by bacteria, right? A gentle processing can be used to create a food mycelium, a fungal mycelium into meat analog. It's a huge research on fermentation to create meat analogs. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that about consumer preference. As I mentioned, that everybody thinks taste, texture, appearance is very important. Without that, they won't buy the alternatives. Now, let's take a meat as an example. It's such a beautiful thing, meat, right? Not good for the environment, but to look, it's such a beautiful thing. It is so nicely structured. For example, it has this nice red proteins, right? And then you have a thin layer of fat, and then the protein, then fat. There's a lot of interfaces here, and there's a lot of water holding proteins inside, and that gives you the juiciness, right? And meat is not just meat. In some part of the world, we like eating only chicken breast piece. But if you come to India, we need bones, right? We don't like to eat only chicken breast piece. We really want to eat chicken attached to the bone and tear it off, and then it is, right? Our perception is different. So we don't want to have eat soya chunks. We want that feeling. We need bones, right? And there's a lot of things has to be done. How do we get that entire thing from the analogs? It's a big challenge. I have no idea how do we get bones out of plants now. Okay. To get this texture, right? To get this shape, now meat is like, see how beautiful it is. We need to get the shape of the food, and for that we need some kind of designs, right? Now we have a new technology in research and development. It's not in commercially available, which we call 3D printing, right? You must have seen 3D printing. It's used in industry a lot. to 3D print. You can 3D print anything today. You can 3D print human beings' shapes. You can 3D print plastics-based things. You can 3D print a computer design. Anything can be blocks. Everything can be 3D printed. Basically, you tell the computer which design you want in a three-dimensional way, and there will be an ink. The ink could be plastic, ink could be anything, and it will be molten. It will make a design what you want. Now we are using 3D printing in the food science also. Instead of the ink, we are going to eat food ingredients, right? You put food ingredients in the inkjet, and now they will print the food you want in the texture. Oh, I deleted those slides at the interest of time, but I'll also take 3D printing in my next classes. So we can create different shapes of food, because children don't like every shapes, right? They like, for example, I have my sister's son, and if I take him to KFC, he doesn't like the big, that roasted leg piece. He likes that small, what is it called? Popcorn chicken, right? Nuggets, exactly. He likes nuggets, right? So how to get that nugget shape? We can get the 3D printing, right? With the plant protein isolates, we can get a nugget structure. There's a lot of things going on today in the market. As I mentioned, just to showcase, things are already in the market, but more work is needed. Why this more work is needed? The first thing is that inadequate protein intake. That's one of the challenges we have today in the market. The second thing is iron deficiency, because the meat analogs might not necessarily contain a good amount of iron, right? This is because iron present in meat and plants in different forms. Doctor says that if you just take iron capsules, it might not be bioavailable completely. You heard about the bioavailability, right? Every minerals is not available in the same form. They would like to be in different forms. Some are attached to some organic molecules, some are attached to something else, some are attached to proteins, and then they are bioavailable. The free iron not necessarily but not bioavailable. So even if the meat analogs are added with lot of iron, those irons might not be bioavailable compared to the iron present in chicken liver, for example. Doctor says that if you have iron deficiency, eat some livers. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but they eat that one, right? Because they say it has a good amount of bioavailable iron. So by mixing things, we need not get the right bioavailability. Although on the paper says it says 1% of iron, but maybe 1% of iron may not be equivalent to 1% of iron present in real meat. Am I clear? So those challenges has to be addressed. Third thing is vitamin B12 problem. Dairy people, especially vegans, we have a lot of dairy analogs today. Vegan cheese is there, vegan milk is there, vegan egg is there, vegan chicken is there. A lot of also a lot of other analogs to coming for this one. But dairy is one of the good sources of vitamin B12, right? It's an important, present in a very small amount, but it's very important vitamin for our body. And if you don't consume it, you will really have a problem in health and diseases. Metabolism can be compromised, and we don't get if you completely turn into plant-based or vegan diet. How do we improve the vitamin B12 content in plant-based foods? A huge research is going on this particular area. Certain bacteria can produce vitamin B12. Certain other things can produce vitamin B12. Then they're thinking about, okay, can we ferment with this particular bacteria, or can you spike vitamin B12 onto food matrices? There's also research scope in this particular area. And another problem is that plant also lacks calcium, meat analogs. So milk contains a lot of calcium. Calcium is important for your bone development, right? And calcium has to be present in the right form to be bioavailable, right? Calcium has to be present with vitamin D to make its bioavailable. There's a lot of combination because food is a complex mixture. They are present in a combination, then they become bioavailable. It's not about the number game. It's not about always quantity in food. It's more about quality, digestibility, bioavailability, and so on. Does that make sense? And I did not talk about the anti-nutrients yet. We have an exclusive lecture on anti-nutrients in the coming class. Plant-based analogs, meat-based analogs, plant-based meals can also come with lot of anti-nutrients. Nobody knows how it is actually whether it's a problem or to what extent it's a problem. We know little about trypsin inhibitor, phytic acid, lignans, oligosaccharides, saponins. Only this much knowledge we have at the moment. But how they're affecting the body, we don't know yet. Okay? And I mentioned that at the end of the day, are all processed. Nobody knows how processing affects. So these are the key challenges we have today on the plant-based processing world. Does that make sense? So this is what I wanted to tell you about where are we today with respect to meat analogs and dairy analogs. We are more focusing on the texture, flavor, taste, and the quantity, and there is a less focus on digestibility, health effects, anti-nutrients, and so on. And those things has to be balanced to make the plant-based foods or the alternative foods sustainable. Not only sustainable, it's also good for the human being. Please, health is a part of sustainability. If you save the world, but if you die quickly, that's not sustainable, right? It has to go hand in hand, right? The world is for us, not only for us, but we are the part of us, right? And there we are at the moment. I'm just highlighting you where are the research gaps we have that you can take in the future if you want to take a plant-based research in the future.